It was the summer of 1944, and the wind that rolled across the sun-drenched plains of central Texas carried more than dust and heat. It carried tension, uncertainty, and rumors that spread from ranch to ranch, from general stores to barbershops. The war in Europe had never felt so close. A new group of German prisoners of war was arriving at Camp Hearn, just outside a quiet town that had, until now, remained mostly untouched by the great conflict overseas. These weren't just any prisoners. These were captured soldiers from North Africa, from Sicily, from Normandy. The people of the town had never laid eyes on a German before, at least not in real life. And now they were living just a few miles away, behind barbed wire fences, guarded by American GIS, and surrounded by suspicion that the townspeople didn't know what to think. Some were afraid. Others were angry. A few were curious. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The prisoners should stay behind the fences. They were the enemy, after all. America was still bleeding. Sons, brothers, husbands, they were still dying in Europe and the Pacific. To see their captors so close, walking in the sun, eating food, breathing the same Texas air, it stirred something in the gut. It didn't feel right. And yet, among the rows of barracks and dusty drills, among the strict routines and endless boredom of the POW camp, there was one man who stood out. His name was Hans Bauer. He had been a school teacher in Munich before the war. A quiet man with soft eyes and a gentle manner. He was no Nazi, at least not by heart. He had been drafted, like so many others, and sent off to fight in North Africa. Captured early, he had spent over 2 years in American custody, moving from camp to camp. But in Camp Hearn, something changed. The opportunity came when a local school in a nearby town struggling to keep up after losing 2 of its teachers to the draft sent out a quiet request through the army. Did anyone, even among the prisoners, know mathematics well enough to help? To everyone's surprise, the army agreed to consider it. And to greater surprise, they chose Hans. The local school board resisted at first. The parents were horrified. A German prisoner teaching American children? It was madness. But the school was desperate. Miss Ellen, the only teacher left, was barely 23 and managing 40 students ranging from ages 6 to 15. She couldn't do it alone. And so, after days of heated discussion, the board gave a reluctant nod, and the army arranged for Hans to begin assisting under close guard. The first day Hans walked into the one-room schoolhouse, silence fell like a hammer. Children stared wide-eyed. Parents waited outside. Even Miss Ellen looked nervous. Hans wore civilian clothes, freshly laundered khakis and a white shirt, but his accent betrayed his origin. He spoke carefully, respectfully, never raising his voice, never assuming too much. He introduced himself simply. "My name is Hans. I love numbers. I hope we can learn them together." At first, the children didn't respond. They avoided his gaze. But Hans had a way about him, calm, kind, patient. He would sit beside a struggling child and guide them gently through the steps of a math problem, always ending with a quiet, "You did very well." When a student got frustrated, he would smile and say, "Mistakes are proof that you are trying." Slowly, very slowly, the room began to soften. Within a week, the older students began asking him questions. By the second week, he was teaching full lessons on geometry and fractions. The children started calling him Mr. Hans, and Miss Ellen found herself with time to breathe, to plan, to smile again. Even the guards, assigned to watch Hans during his time at the school, started to relax. He posed no threat. He was, if anything, a better teacher than most they'd seen. But not everyone in town approved. At the diner at the post office, angry whispers persisted. My boy's in France, dodging bullets from men just like him. one man said. And now that man's teaching our kids? It felt wrong. Like betrayal. Like forgetting. And yet the children were learning. One boy, Tommy, had never liked school. He was the son of a rancher, tough, stubborn, barely passing. But something about Hans clicked with him. One day, Tommy stayed after class and asked Hans, "Were you scared when you were captured?" Hans paused, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I was scared of what would happen. I didn't know if I would ever see my home again. But I was lucky. I was treated well. And now I am here with you." Tommy never forgot that. Neither did the others. Hans never spoke about politics, never mentioned Hitler or the Reich. When asked about Germany, he would talk about the Alps or the Christmas markets or the way the snow looked on the rooftops of Munich. He made Germany seem human, not monstrous. And that scared some of the adults even more. But over time, something changed. A parent who had once protested Hans's presence showed up one day with a pie. She left it silently on the school steps. Another offered to mend his torn shirt. A third asked him to tutor her daughter in algebra. Then came the day of the tornado. A freak storm hit the edge of town late one afternoon, knocking over power lines and tearing the roof off part of the schoolhouse. Children screamed. Windows shattered. In the chaos, Hans grabbed 3 children and shielded them with his own body beneath a desk. When the storm passed, the guards found him bleeding from a deep gash on his arm, but the children were safe. Word spread quickly. From that day on, no one questioned Hans's place in the school. He continued teaching until the end of the war. When the order came to repatriate the POWs, the town gathered at the train station to say goodbye. Children cried. Parents shook his hand. Miss Ellen wept openly. Hans Bauer, the German POW, who had once been seen as the enemy, left as a hero. Years later, former students would still talk about him. At reunions, at weddings, at funerals, they would remember Mr. Hans, the quiet man who taught them not just about numbers, but about forgiveness, courage, and the simple power of human decency. The train whistle echoed through the town as Hans Bauer disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind more than memories. He had left a legacy. For many, his departure felt heavier than they had anticipated. The war had taken so much, but Hans had, in his quiet and unassuming way, given something back. Something no one expected. In the weeks following his departure, the school felt quieter, less alive. Miss Ellen resumed teaching, and though the students tried their best, there was an unmistakable gap. Not in knowledge, but in energy. In warmth. Years passed. The war ended. Soldiers returned home, some in one piece, others broken, and many not at all. The town of Herne adjusted to peace slowly, almost cautiously. For a time, no one mentioned Hans. It was easier to bury that chapter beneath new ones, weddings, jobs, rebuilding. But for the children who had once been his students, the memory remained vivid. Tommy, the rancher's son, grew into a quiet, hard-working teenager. He never forgot the way Hans had talked about courage, not as something grand, but as small decisions made every day, especially when no one was watching. Tommy would later say that Hans taught him more than school ever could. He taught me how to be a man without ever saying so. In 1952, nearly 8 years after Hans had left, a letter arrived at the school. It was handwritten, in clean, looping cursive, and addressed to the children of Herne School. Inside was a note from Hans. He was alive, living back in Munich, working once again as a schoolteacher. He spoke of the difficulties Germany faced after the war, the ruins, the hunger, the guilt, but also of hope. He mentioned how often he thought of the children in Texas, how they had given him reason to believe in goodness again. Enclosed with the letter were 5 drawings, each of small Bavarian villages, drawn by his new students. He asked if Miss Ellen would share them with her class. The letter sent ripples through the town. For some, it reopened old wounds, but for others, especially the former students, it was like hearing from a long-lost uncle. A few wrote back, then more. Over the next several years, Hans and several of his former students maintained correspondence. The letters were not political. They didn't speak of ideologies. They were about life farming, weather, school stories, local festivals. They were about shared humanity. In 1958, Tommy made a decision that surprised everyone. Using money he had saved from working cattle drives and odd jobs, he boarded a ship bound for Europe. His destination, Munich. His purpose, to find Mr. Hans. It took weeks. Hans had moved, and addresses had changed. But eventually, with the help of an American consulate and a few kind strangers, Tommy stood at the doorstep of a modest home nestled in a quiet Munich neighborhood. He knocked. The door opened slowly. Hans looked older, thinner, his hair more gray than Tommy remembered. But the eyes, those same kind, intelligent eyes, had not changed. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Hans stepped forward and embraced the young man. He had once taught long division to under the Texas sun. The reunion lasted 3 days. They spoke of everything and nothing. Tommy met Hans's wife, a nurse who had survived the bombings in Dresden. He saw Hans's classroom, met his students. Before leaving, Tommy handed Hans a photograph. It was of the old Herne schoolhouse, with a note on the back that simply read, "Still standing. Still learning. Because of you." Back in Texas, Tommy became somewhat of a legend. The town, once divided over Hans's presence, now embraced his memory. The school even dedicated a small library corner in his name, the Hans Bauer Reading Nook. Children who had never met him would sit beneath the small plaque. Unaware of the quiet revolution he had sparked years before. In 1965, Hans returned the visit. This time, it was official. The U.S. State Department had invited several former POWs who had demonstrated exceptional post-war reconciliation efforts. Hans was one of them. When he arrived in Texas, a crowd was waiting at the train station. Children, now adults, holding signs, waving flags. Miss Ellen, now married and nearing retirement, stood at the front, tears streaming down her cheeks. The reunion was emotional. Hans toured the schoolhouse, which hadn't changed much. He was shown the plaque, the library corner. He gave a small speech, his voice trembling as he said, "I came here as a prisoner, but I leave again as a friend." That night, a town hall gathering was held in his honor. Stories were shared. Laughter echoed. And beneath it all, there was a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened in that schoolhouse during the war. Something that defied the headlines. Something deeply human. Hans returned to Germany days later, but the bond remained. Over the years, as global tensions rose and fell, as new wars were fought and new alliances formed, the story of the German POW, who taught in Texas, quietly endured. In 1974, Hans passed away from heart complications. The news reached Herne through a letter from his wife. The town held a small memorial. Flowers were placed beneath his plaque. Old students traveled from neighboring counties to pay their respects. Tommy, now in his 40s, stood before the gathered crowd and said, "He taught us numbers. But more than that, he taught us how to look at someone and see a person, not a uniform, not a label, just a person." It was a lesson the town never forgot. The years following Hans Bauer's death were filled with quiet remembrance across Herne, Texas. For some, he was a gentle ghost of a turbulent time. For others, especially those whose lives he had touched directly, he remained a symbol of change, of the better angels that sometimes surfaced even in war. His legacy began to take root deeper than anyone had expected. It wasn't just a corner of the school library anymore. It was in the way some of those children, now adults, chose to live their lives, teach their own children, and see the world. One of those children was Sarah Millwood, the daughter of a cotton farmer who had once been suspicious of the enemy, but found herself mesmerized by the way Hans spoke about geography. He didn't just name countries, he painted pictures of mountain ranges and rivers with his words. She remembered his explanation of the Danube, how it connected so many cultures, and it sparked something inside her. Sarah became the first girl from her town to attend university out of state. She studied languages and eventually became a teacher herself. In her classroom, decades later, a black and white photograph of Hans stood in a frame above her CHOKBOARD. Then there was Michael Caine, who never forgot the time Hans taught him to solve a math problem no other teacher could make him understand. That moment made him feel seen, capable. He would go on to become an engineer working on public infrastructure projects across Texas. In a radio interview much later, he said, "Everything I ever built had a little bit of Hans in it." But the story didn't end in personal achievements. In the late 1980s, Hearn historians began to collect oral histories from war-era residents. Among the dozens of accounts, Hans's name appeared over and over again. He became a local mystery to outsiders, how a captured enemy soldier came to earn the town's affection. A local journalist named David Romero became intrigued. What began as a simple newspaper feature turned into a 5-part documentary titled The Enemy Who Taught Us. It aired statewide, and suddenly Hans Bauer was no longer just a memory for a small town. He became a symbol of reconciliation across Texas. The documentary sparked conversations across the country. Letters poured in from people who remembered similar POW camps and prisoners who had worked in farms, railroads, and factories. A few remembered men like Hans' men, who, while technically enemies, had behaved with humility and grace. Stories emerged of other POWs who taught music, repaired machinery, or helped on local farms. But Hans's story remained singular because of the deep personal connection he had formed with children, and the town's open recognition of it. In 1992, on what would have been Hans's 75th birthday, the town of Hearn held a public ceremony. The schoolhouse had since been renovated, but one classroom had been preserved in its original form, complete with wooden desks, a cast-iron stove, and chalkboards framed with oak. In that room, surrounded by former students, local officials unveiled a bronze plaque bearing Hans's name. It read, "In this room, during a time of war, a man from the other side taught peace, respect, and knowledge. May we never forget that understanding can bloom even in captivity." The ceremony wasn't flashy. There were no politicians, no cameras, just people. Real people who had lived through the contradictions of war and the quiet victories of humanity. Miss Ellen, then in her late 80s, was wheeled to the front row. When asked if she remembered Hans, she smiled softly and replied, "Some teachers leave apples. He left something you can't see, but feel every day you walk in this building." In Germany, the documentary had also aired on a small international network. One of the viewers was Hans's granddaughter, Liesel, who had grown up hearing fragments of stories about Texas and the children. She had always assumed they were family folklore. Watching the series, she wept. Determined to learn more, she reached out to the Hearn Historical Society. In 1994, Liesel traveled to Hearn. The visit was quiet, private. She met some of Hans's former students, now in their 60s and 70s. One of them, Sarah Millwood, gave her the original letter Hans had sent the school back in 1952. Liesel, holding the letter in trembling hands, said, "My grandfather never stopped talking about Texas. I didn't know he meant this much to all of you." Sarah smiled. He meant more than he ever knew. Inspired by the journey, Liesel returned to Germany and wrote a memoir based on Hans's wartime journals, which had been stored in her attic for years. The book, titled Letters from Texas, became a quiet bestseller in Germany. It wasn't political. It didn't discuss military strategy or war crimes. It was about identity, compassion, and the strange ways life binds people together across oceans and ideologies. Years later, Hearn built a new library. Inside, there's a room with large windows, wooden shelves, and a mural painted on the back wall. The mural shows a POW camp in the background, the Texas schoolhouse in the center, and a group of children gathered around a tall man writing equations on a blackboard dot at the bottom of the mural. The words are simple. He came in chains. He left in hearts. In the final years of her life, Sarah Millwood often walked the quiet streets of Hearn in the early morning, just before the sun began to climb over the rooftops. The town had changed, of course. New storefronts, newer cars. A different generation of children playing near the train tracks where once, decades ago, the trains brought in men like Hans Bauer, yet something in the air remained familiar, a quiet dignity, a warmth that seemed to echo from the past. Every Sunday, she visited the preserved classroom in the old school building. She would sit in the front desk, the same one where she had once nervously solved math problems under Hans's gentle guidance. She didn't come to remember just the lessons. She came to remember what the lessons meant. That even during the hardest times, someone could choose to be kind. That even prisoners, labeled enemies by the world, could be mentors, peacemakers, even family. By the early 2000s, Hans Bauer's story was being taught in high school history classes across Texas as part of a broader effort to highlight untold stories from World War II. It stood in sharp contrast to the narratives of violence and devastation. Here was a man who had arrived in America as a captive, yet had left a legacy of compassion and connection. Teachers used the story to spark discussion about identity, forgiveness, and the power of education to heal wounds. One student, Jason Rodriguez, was especially moved. He was the son of Mexican immigrants, the first in his family to pursue higher education. Inspired by Hans's story, he wrote an award-winning essay on the redemptive potential of second chances. If a German POW could teach American children during wartime, he wrote, then maybe we're all more capable of grace than we think. Jason would later win a scholarship to study education policy, and in his acceptance speech, he quoted Hans, "The only prison stronger than steel is the one we build around our minds." Meanwhile, in Germany, Liesel Bauer continued to speak about her grandfather's story at schools and museums. She worked closely with organizations focused on reconciliation and historical memory. Her memoir, Letters from Texas, was translated into 7 languages and became a cornerstone text in post-war cultural studies. At one university seminar, a professor remarked, Hans Bauer didn't just teach children in Texas. He taught all of us how to be human. In 2008, a filmmaker from Austin proposed a feature-length dramatization of Hans's life. After years of interviews, location scouting, and script revisions, the film premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival under the title The Classroom. It was a quiet film, absent of explosions or battle scenes. Instead, it focused on conversations between Hans and the children, on the small, powerful moments, a hesitant handshake, a shared laugh over broken English, the chalk dust on his fingers as he drew maps of places most Texans had never heard of. The film received critical acclaim for its restraint and emotional weight. More importantly, it reignited interest in the POW camps of Texas. Visitors began arriving in Hearn, not just for the festivals or family roots, but to walk the path Hans had walked. The town, once just a dot on the map during the war, now held a place in the larger American story. The classroom became a historical site. Volunteers, many of them retired teachers or former students of Hans, gave guided tours. They spoke not of war, but of learning, not of enemies, but of the chance encounters that can shape a lifetime. School children came in buses, wide-eyed, listening to stories of how a German man in a brown uniform once stood where their teachers now stood, speaking softly, drawing hope on a blackboard with a stick of chalk dot in one journal entry, found decades later in a dusty German archive. Hans had written during his first week in the classroom, "These children do not look at me with hate. They are curious. They smile. In their eyes, I am not a soldier. I am simply a man with a story." Maybe that is enough. He had been right. As Sarah's health declined, she entrusted the classroom key and her collection of letters, photos, and articles to the town's historical society. In her final note, she wrote, "Hans taught us during a time when the world had forgotten how to listen. Let us never forget how he made us feel." When she passed away, the town held a joint memorial service in the schoolhouse, with her photo next to Hans's, a recording of Hans's voice from one of the old documentary tapes, played gently through the room. Kindness has no uniform. In the years that followed, more stories emerged. Other POWs who had found ways to give back quietly, humbly. But none like Hans. His story became not just an exception, but a beacon. A reminder that humanity is not erased by war, it is tested. And sometimes it passes the test in the unlikeliest of places. Today, in the small town of Hearne, Texas, when a child asks who Hans Bauer was, they're told he was a teacher. Not a soldier. Not a prisoner. A teacher. And in a world that often forgets its own lessons, that is perhaps the most powerful legacy of all.